recorded, but if you must. Okay, so this is very much a draft. And I have been mulling over the ideas for a while, but I didn't actually sit down to try to write anything down until this morning. So it will need a lot of work. But anyway, okay, here we go. When I began, and I am going to read what I wrote because it'll try to keep me more limited to the time. When I began my deep dive into my ancestry in 2020, I started uncovering lots of fascinating and sometimes disturbing facts about my family origins and the participation of my ancestors in making this country what it has become for good and for ill. But one thing I had not anticipated was finding an ecological connection between most of my ancestors on my dad's side. I'd always heard growing up that my dad's family lived in what's known as the Piney Woods region of deep East Texas. In fact, the Baptist church that my dad attended as a child was informally known as the Church of the Piney Woods. But did I connect that to the pine forest that dominated northern and central Florida, where I grew up, or much of South Carolina, where I went to college? Absolutely not. Pine trees, for me, growing up, were like wallpaper. They were just the boring backdrop to the much more interesting flowers and trees that had more color and more uses for me. Trees that could be climbed, for example. Then one day, I was reading an article online about East Texas, and I stumbled upon a description of the longleaf pine forests of the Piney Woods region that gave it its name. And I was stunned to read that these forests were not limited to East Texas or even to its next door neighbor, Louisiana, but extended all the way to Virginia. In fact, the longleaf pine ecosystem originally ranged over some 90 million acres, from the upper coastal plain to the Piedmont in all 9 coastal states, from Virginia to Texas. At the same time, I was discovering that virtually all of my ancestors on my dad's side had lived in one or more of these states. Most of his ancestors had come in through Virginia and eventually taken a southerly migration route across the Gulf states to Texas. In other words, what I discovered is that my people were the people of the longleaf pine forest. But here's the thing. Unlike the Native American nations, who I have also since discovered co-evolved over thousands of years with and carefully cared for, even we might say managed, the longleaf pine forests, so much so that when Europeans arrived, it looked like virgin wilderness. My people and other European settlers swarmed across the longleaf pine forests like locusts, literally chewing through them and displacing them with man-made farms, towns, cities, and industries. In fact, the incredibly strong and straight longleaf pine trunks and the turpentine, pitch, and tar that could be produced from these pines built the British Imperial Navy. The bodies of longleaf pine built 17th and 18th century London. And now, I just learned this morning, serve British royalty as the walls and floors of Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The longleaf pine forest ecosystem was the most diverse ecosystem north of the tropics in North America. And yet, since the arrival of Europeans, all but 3% of the original forest has been destroyed. Most of this actually happened in a frenzy of industrial scale logging between 1880 and 1920, just 40 years, a good biblical number, was all it took to virtually eradicate the greatest and most diverse living ecosystem in North America. Now people are rushing to save the remaining stands of longleaf pine and to plant more in all of these states, which is wonderful. But whatever comes of that, the southeastern longleaf pine forest will never be the noble giant that it was. So that got me thinking in the middle of the night last night. And I apologize because this story is a little dark. But when my people arrived and began migrating across the South, longleaf pines were so omnipresent, they seemed inexhaustible, as reliable as wallpaper, as sturdy as Balmoral Castle. They could travel for days, weeks, months, a lifetime, and not run out of longleaf pines. So I started wondering, what do we take for granted like that we could just as easily lose? What if in another 100 years, our current practices have led to the death of all but 3% of our current bird species, or our current amphibian or insect species, or 3% of the life in the oceans? What would it be like to live in a world without birds or bees or fish? Could we even live at all? And what would our descendants say about the ancestors that left behind such a world? So my big question is, can we act now to make sure that all of these amazing species and ecosystems that we love are not diminished down to 3% of what they are today?
Thank you,
Wow.
Janet.
Thank you, Janet, indeed. Wow. And that was like a masterclass in Marshall Gantz's model of the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. It was like really, really clear. So Ecofaith Practice 2 engages us in developing relationships to consciously awaken the power among that arise